For more on this, we're now joined by Colonel Rich Outzen from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. Thanks very much for speaking to us here on WION. Let's talk about Bakhmut, where Russian advances have reportedly been stalled for now. How do you see the fight going forward from here on? Can Ukraine turn the tide, or do you think Russia is very likely to take this eastern town?
Well, it's good to be with you. Thank you for having me. My opinion on this, my view of this has changed over the past week because the Russian forces and the Wagner forces especially seemed to have momentum heading into last weekend, but they've suffered tremendous losses. And there was a decision taken in Kyiv to not to abandon, but indeed to reinforce the defenses of the city. So what we've seen coming out of social media reports and analyses from the Institute for the Study of War and others shows that Wagner has had significant personnel losses and in some cases is losing momentum because they no longer have fresh units to feed into the offensive. So there's a river, the Bakhmutka, that runs north and south through the middle of town. The fighting seems to have stabilized on that line. That gives a fairly good defensible position to the defenders in the western half of the city. And it looks to me that Kyiv is intent on bleeding Wagner especially, and on making any additional advances very painful and very costly. So far they seem to be succeeding at doing that.
All right. Talking about the Wagner group, what do you make of the statement that's been made by the Wagner chief? Apart from saying that he wants to run for Ukraine president in 2024, he's raised questions about the competence of Russian defense officials. Do you see tensions simmering in Moscow between the Wagner group and the Russian forces, or the defense ministry at the very least?
Absolutely. I think what you're seeing in public sort of information spaces, whether that be official media or on social media, that there's a loss of control of the message by the people right around Putin and even the official sort of propaganda outlets for the Russians. We're seeing dissenting voices. You're seeing fighting between sort of information fighting, propaganda fighting between Prigozhin especially and the military leadership, Shoigu and others, Gerasimov. You're seeing also open criticism of the war effort. I think they've lost message control in Moscow, and Prigozhin should not be taken as serious when he talks about running for presidency of Ukraine. He's from St. Petersburg. He's a Russian and not at all Ukrainian, and he'd be strung up by his heels, I think, if he were to show up in most parts of Ukraine. We should understand his statements as part of his propaganda war and his political war against the other elites in Moscow, because clearly there's stress on Putin, there's stress on his inner circle, there's criticism coming from many different directions. In many ways, this is a struggle for not just the message, but the direction of the war in future years. And especially if Russia does not successfully conclude this war, if it drags on for years, or if Russian forces in Ukraine are routed and actually lose their positions that they currently have, there's going to be a political shuffle that follows from that. And I think Prigozhin is positioning himself against others that have been critical of Putin and critical of the war.
And it's also interesting what the Ukrainian president said recently, that he believes Russian President Vladimir Putin will fall to his own men. Of course, the war has... Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, and which one of those men, right? That's sort of what's going on here. Something that was less noticed about Prigozhin in the last couple of days also is that he's essentially said that he is opening his own recruiting centers in many parts of the Russian Federation. He's going to recruit his own private army. This is going beyond, and we've seen Wagner go to prisons before to try to get inmates. He's going to have ideological indoctrination arms within his forces. If you think of like the Iraqi Republican Guard and that sort of a Republican elite guard type military that's separate from the rest of the military. In Iran, of course, you have the IRGC. That's essentially what's going on here. They are forming a separate, highly ideological military parallel to the official military. And this is the horse that Prigozhin will ride in the political battles after the war.
Well, it certainly is interesting, but we'll have to wait and see how things pan out in the days and weeks ahead, especially in the Bakhmut region. On that note, Colonel Rich Outzen, thank you so much for speaking to WION.
Indeed, thank you.